what that's going to tell us about the future of warfare. First, be aware that we will be recording this event for the benefit of those who are not able to attend tonight, and it will be posted on our Braver Angels channel. Second, we will be sending you messages in the chat, so please keep that open for the duration of the event. Now, I want to give a quick introduction for those who may not be aware of Braver Angels. Braver Angels is an organization created to bring Americans together and to bridge the partisan divide and strengthen our democratic republic. Our military and veterans group, let me go ahead and give you a bit more of this. Our military and veterans group is one of many specialty groups within Braver Angels, and our specific mission is to bring together veterans and those whose military service has instilled them with the importance of unity, teamwork, and a country-first mentality in order to promote the Braver Angels mission and grow our membership base. Now, our goal in hosting these events is dual purpose. First, to offer that invitation to our fellow veterans to join us in working to reduce polarization in our nation. And second, to offer our fellow Braver Angels a military perspective, which they may be unfamiliar with. Now, quickly, our agenda tonight. We're going to first listen to Dr. Charles Bartles' presentation, and then we are going to send all of you into small breakout rooms so you can discuss with others what you've heard, and as groups, come back with questions you would like to ask Chuck. After about 60 minutes of questions from you, I will provide some closing remarks. And a few last pieces of admin. I want to introduce my team. Elise is our breakout room manager, and we'll be putting you into breakout rooms. And all that should happen automatically, so don't worry about any of that. Donna and Taylor are our participant managers. Please reach out to them in the chat if you have any questions about the program. And Stan is our troubleshooter, and his number is in the chat. Contact him if you get disconnected or are having other technical challenges. Now, during Dr. Bartle's presentation, we will be keeping everyone muted. So later, when you are in groups, you will need to unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon. And also, closed captions have been enabled. You can turn those on by selecting the three-dot icon below your display and selecting closed captions. And now the reason why you are all here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Charles Bartles. I want to start by giving a bit more background on our guest distinguished speaker. Dr. Charles K. Bartles is an analyst and Russian linguist at the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His specific research areas include Russian and Central Asian military force structure, modernization, tactics, officer enlisted professional development, and security assistance programs. Chuck is also a space operations officer and lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, commanding a military intelligence detachment in Lincoln, Nebraska. He deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq and has served as a security assistance officer at embassies in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. Chuck has a BA in Russian from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln and a master's in arts in Russian and Eastern European studies from the University of Kansas and a PhD from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is the co-author of the book, The Russian Way of War, Force Structure, Tactics, and the Modernization of Russian Ground Forces, which was published in 2019. Now, this evening, Dr. Bartles will discuss his thoughts on what the current conflict in Ukraine can tell us about how modern warfare is changing and how it is not. Sir, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks for having me. And I realize time is short, so I'll get right into it. And first of all, I'll talk a little bit about my assumptions. And what those assumptions are is generally I believe that the Russians armed forces, have, are, and will continue to adapt. If you've watched the news, sometimes you hear the kind of the narrative that the Russians are incompetent and and I generally don't agree with that. I believe the Russians have been adapting, but those adaptations haven't really been meeting Western expectations. So they've been adapting, but not the way we would expect. And if the question is, if the Russians are adapting, and they're not adapting in the way that we expect, you know, what's going on there? And the answer is I think the Russians are getting very, very different lessons learned about the military conflict than what we're getting in at least the United States and generally the West. And the Russians, generally the Western narrative or the narrative you hear over here is that the Russians are bad at tactics, they have bad logistics, they can't get anything right. But generally, kind of the view, in general, the Russian view that the Russians believe why they weren't successful invading Ukraine was because they didn't have a large enough army to do the job. I'll kind of walk over what that looks like. And it kind of, you can go to the next slide if you want to. And then if to kind of wrap that up, if we think about success in combat, you can have tactical success in a war, but still have strategic failure. So think about what happened to the United States Army in Afghanistan, or the United States military in general. We had a lot of tactical success in Afghanistan, but at the end of the day, I think it was a strategic failure. I think most people would agree, we as a country had failure in Afghanistan. We did not achieve the objectives we came there that we had initially established. And also the inverse is true. You can definitely have tactical failure that results in strategic success. Now, this is definitely not as common, but the U.S. has been a victim to this also. If you think about what happened in the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, I think 68, 69, when they had the Tet Offensive, if you look at the Tet Offensive from a military perspective, it was a failure in every category. The Vietnamese, North Vietnamese did not take any territory. They took heavy casualties. The U.S. and allied forces did not take very many casualties. It was a failure at the tactical level. But at the strategic level, the Tet Offensive was a great success. Why was it a success? Because it kind of broke the U.S.'s will to continue in the fight. And a few years later, we stopped supporting South Vietnam, and it changed the perspective. Before we thought we could win, it changed the U.S. population's perspective to think we were in a long quagmire that we would never pull out of. And eventually, U.S. withdrew support from South Vietnam. So we'll keep that in mind, and I'll reach back to that point as we go through the brief. Next slide, please. And just kind of scene setting before we get into what actually happened there. We'll talk a little bit about this man here, Vladimir Putin. And one of the things that happened before the invasion was that Vladimir Putin, in July of 2021, he wrote this, I called a treatise. It was a very long paper about the history of Ukraine. And the gist of it, that the history of Ukraine it wasn't a real country, and Ukrainians were actually Russians, and most Ukrainians wanted to be part of the Russian Federation. They wanted to get rid of this government that they believed that the U.S. had installed in 2014 during the revolution. So that was kind of the narrative that Putin wrote. And that narrative would have impact on the way this operation would happen about a year later, and I'll kind of lay out what that is. And again, there was another thing that was going on, so think about what the Russians were looking at in late 2021, early 2022. They were looking at how effective the U.S. was in the world. They had just seen the U.S. pull out of Afghanistan, and the government of Afghanistan collapsed even before the U.S. had withdrawn. Now, remember, when the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, that government stayed for, until the 90s. So that government was there for quite some time. But the government that the U.S. installed fell apart immediately as soon as they started backing out. So that was something that was on my mind. It was that, the U.S. was not very good at doing security assistance and supporting other countries. And there's also something about Zelensky. If you think of whatever happened in Ukraine, every time there was a crisis or a tragedy in Ukraine, usually the presidents would get on planes and fly out of the country at the first sign of trouble. And that's what happened with the previous leaders. And I think that's what the understanding what Zelensky would do too, is as soon as the going got rough and they realized something was going to happen, the leadership of the country would depart, because that would have happened in previous years. In terms of Russians, Russians are very technical when it comes to military planning. And the Russians have very strict definitions for what military operations are. And I think I might have some people with some military background in the room, but generally we think of a military operation, we think of a grouping of tanks or, armor or different things, artillery, all working together to achieve a given objective. And that's kind of the way the Russians see it too. When they talk about military operations, for the most part, Generally, you need multiple military operations if you want to achieve a strategic objective, a military political goal. So if your goal is to annex a given piece of territory, you need multiple consecutive or concurrent or consecutive military operations to achieve that goal in the Russian understanding. There's also another type of military. There's other types of military operations in the Russians thought. The strategic operations of nuclear forces, strategic aerospace operations, but generally those are kind of one and done things. So you do those one event, you launch nuclear weapons, and that achieves the objective right away. So keep that in mind, and I'll come back to what special military operation here is on the following slide. And kind of in that same vein, the Russians, in terms of Russian military thought, there was a long history, even back before the Soviet Union, back before World War I, about what a country does when they go to war. What do you do in that initial period of war, in that time frame leading up to hostilities, and that first few days or weeks of the war? What are the things you do? So Russians had a very well-developed plan for what you do for the initial period of war. And I'll tell you why that's important here. Can you go to the next slide, please? And just a couple more things for scene setting for the Russians. We think about our World War II experience. We think about large-scale combat operations. A lot of things we go back to, World War II in Korea. And if you think about World War II in Korea, in terms of casualties, we had 16 million men in uniform, mostly men, and we had about 400,000 deaths. So if you were a U.S. serviceman in uniform in World War II, you probably had a 41 chance of surviving, right? Those are pretty good odds. If you look for the Soviet Union, they had 34 million men in uniform, and they had 10 million casualties. So, 1 in every 3 died. So that's a big difference between the casualty rate. And that's an important, as we go through about the Russians' understanding, and now the Russians' understanding about how war looks and what war actually entails. So we'll talk about that a little later. And generally, when the Russians declared the special military operation, I mentioned earlier that, there's different types of military operations. So what's a special military operation? Well, the term special military operation from kind of most Russian theorists was believed to be a combined arms operation, just a single combined arms operation designed to achieve the military political goal. And that military political goal was toppling the government of Ukraine and destroying the military. And generally, we don't know exactly why the Russians thought they could do this. The Ukrainians have probably the second, or before the war had the second or the third largest military in Europe. We don't know why the Russians thought they could do this, but we think what that reasoning was is because of that treatise that Putin wrote before. So you can imagine if you're a U.S. military planner and the president tells you, this is the situation that you're going into, the people are going to love you. They're going to reach out there with bread and salt. That was the situation that the Russian military was involved with. The president told them what the environment was going to look like. So I think that's what the general staff, or whoever, I don't know if it's the general staff, whoever planned that operation, that's what they had to do. And generally what the Russians wanted to do was something that they've done many times before. If you look at what the Russians did in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Afghanistan, the Russians do go in with a large airborne operation, topple the government, and then take over the main government buildings, and then hold on. And then they've had real good success with that in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Afghanistan. And obviously it didn't work out for them in Ukraine. The thing, the Russians did this operation. They brought 67% of their ground fighters. Generally what they did is they left their conscripts in the barracks. And this is a very, very first for the Soviets or for the Russians or even for the Imperial Army. Usually the conscripts were always involved. So the Russians left these conscripts in their barracks and just brought the professional force out to fight. And that had some consequences for them later. So generally, can you go to the next slide, please? So kind of get into the Russian narrative of what happened. Generally, even the Russians believed that first month of the war was just an unmitigated disaster. There's not much of a question with the Russians' understanding of that. But very quickly, the Russians kind of changed their tune. Before, it was obvious they wanted that initial quick victory, but very quick within that first month after they gave up on taking Kiev immediately, they told their people something, we usually don't tell our civilians. They said, we're going to be in for a very long war. Remember what happened in 2007, 2008? What did we say? We said we were going to do a big surge, bring in a lot of troops, and we were going to, pacify the situation. The Russians said this is going to be a long war. So right away, there's some messaging to that civilian population. Things are going to be a little bit different here. And then since those conscripts that I mentioned, since those conscripts were not brought out to the fight, Russia lost a lot of its best and brightest soldiers in those early days. So in the Russian way of war, usually, those conscripts are there to kind of soak up the casualties so you can keep your professional fighting force strong. That's not what happened in the smoke. The Russians did not bring those conscripts, so a lot of their highly trained, their best trained officers and sergeants were getting clipped, and that caused a big problem for them. So all those casualties were focused in the professional force instead of being kind of spread out through the population. And we talk about, once the conflict started going after a few months, then the Western support started to arrive. And that Western support was important, but from the Russian perspective, that wasn't the most important thing they were getting. It was the targeting data that they were getting. And so if you think about what the US and the allies were doing around that time, they were collecting information, believe, and then giving that to the Ukrainians. And that's what the Russians were really concerned about, because they'd war gamed fighting the US and NATO before, but they'd never envisioned fighting the US and NATO without being able to target our collection assets. And they couldn't do that just due to the situation. So the Ukrainians were getting the information, they could use it, and the Russians didn't have a lot of ways of kind of balancing that out. So they kind of moving along, it's just interest of time. So if you think about the narrative of it, generally currently in the West, still that there's kind of a narrative that the Russians are somewhat incompetent. But if you look at the narrative in the rest of the world, the Asia, Africa, Middle East, Global South, there's a narrative that the Russian military is kind of defeating the U.S., NATO, and the West. And obviously, U.S., NATO troops aren't out there fighting, but before, kind of the narrative was if the West was going to impose sanctions, a country was going to be soon to collapse. And what they saw in 2022 was the Russians had every sort of sanctions you could have thrown at them by the West, and the Russians kept on fighting. And I think a lot of people are now kind of looking at this and kind of reevaluating and say, hey, is this really what's happening now? So it's very common. I think it's a very common view in the rest of the world that the Russian military is actually doing very well, and that the U.S. NATO is a lot weaker than a lot of these other people thought. Next slide, please. And talk about the consequences of failure or success here. This man here his name's Konstantin Sivkov, and I would say he's a talking head, but I would say he's a very well-respected member of the kind of Russian intelligentsia, military intelligentsia. If you turn on a Russian talk show, and if you follow military and security matters, you're going to know who this guy is. He's pretty prolific in terms of writing, and I would say he's a media personality, but he's on a lot of Russian talk shows, periodically talking about military issues. And then the first month of the war, he wrote an article that talked about the consequences of either Ukraine or Russia winning in this war. And he sees it like as a much bigger picture. In the West, we kind of see it as the Russians are going out there and taking some Ukrainian territory, which I definitely believe is true. But he has a little bit more of expansive view. And I think this view that he has is the same with a lot of the Russians in the security sector. They kind of see it the same way. And his view was that if that the West is kind of pushing our liberal values on the rest of the world. So you think about what gay rights and a lot of the other things that the Russians really oppose. A lot of these things are definitely opposed in Africa, Middle East, and other places. And one of the things the Russia says is that the West is imposing their values, their new Western values, on other countries that have traditional values. And one of the things that Sivkov sees is that whoever wins this war, if the Ukrainians win or if the Russians win, whoever wins this war is going to be a big push for one of those sets of values to the detriment of the other. Does that make sense? So it's kind of out there, but I think it's a very common view in Russia and a lot of other places in the world. So there's definitely a big picture view of what's going on. Sometimes you hear people talk about, the Russians don't like the Western rules-based order after World War II. That's very, very true, and that's what they're talking about. They believe that the kind of the rules-based order that was set up after World War II is weighted heavily in favor of European countries and the United States, Canada, and they definitely kind of want to reset the playing field. Next slide, please. talk about lessons learned. I know you guys want to know about lessons learned, and so the Russians, the UAVs, the unmanned aerial vehicles, and the technology changes. Those things are important for the Russians, but that's not the most important thing for the Russians. For the Russians, it's that will to fight. You can talk about all kinds of technology and stuff, but at the end of the day, it's about will to fight. The Afghans had all sorts of technological and material advantages over the Taliban, but the Taliban was able to win. Why? Because the Afghan government did not have the will to fight. The Taliban definitely did. And you'll see the Russian civilian population also has that will to fight. And there's kind of a belief with the Russians that they have a will to fight. The civilians there do, but the U.S. Western populations do not. Russian civilian population actively supports their military. Now, I know, I think a lot of Americans support their military. They may send some, goodie packages and stuff in the mail, but actually Russian civilians, make a lot less money than their Western equivalents, but they'll go out there and they'll buy like body armor or unmanned aerial vehicles or very expensive pieces of kit and send those things out. There's a lot of blood drive and stuff like that are going on. So the civilian population is engaged in what's going on. And there's a belief with the Russians that small volunteer armies with highly trained personnel are great for peacetime and counterinsurgency. I think what we've been doing for the last 50 years, actually 70 years since World War II, but mass is required for large scale war. So success in war is not just about the military, it's about mustering all the nation's resources. And that's kind of what the Russians are talking about. When you go to war, you just don't go to war with your military. You go all in with your population. Next slide, please. And some of the changes is the Russians have talked about making huge changes to their military. The Russians had about 1 million man military before this conflict. Now they're going to go up to 1.5 million, and they're definitely well on the way to doing that. And some people doubt it, but I think they'll definitely have a 1.5 million man army, among other changes. They're definitely growing the size of their force because they see more conflict in the future, right? And I guarantee you, if they plan on annexing other territories in other countries, there's definitely going to be more conflict in their future. So it's my personal opinion. Next slide, please. And Russians, they talk a lot about how they're going to defeat NATO. It's kind of in the back of their mind. They do see a war on the horizon. And you hear the Russians talk a lot about war of attrition. And for the Russians, when they talk about war of attrition, definitely there's material resources to that, but it's also about a will to fight. And that's what they're interested in building, is that will to fight. And when they look at what's going on with the Ukraine war right now, they look at, how the Western countries are responding just to providing material resources. So think about the donor fatigue, how many billions of dollars are we sending to Ukraine? And they see, there's a lot of, obviously right now, a lot of bulking in Congress about more assets being provided to Ukraine. And the Russians are watching that. And the Russians believe that the U.S. NATO has volunteer armies with popular elected governments. So what does that mean if you have a volunteer army with popular elected government? So think about, the U.S. Army in the last few years. In a peacetime environment, the U.S. Army had a deficit. We missed our recruiting goal of 15,000 soldiers in 2022. And then in 2023, we missed our recruiting goal by 10,000 soldiers. That was in a peacetime environment. Can you imagine what that would be like if we had a wartime environment? What would our casualty rate, or what would our recruiting potential be if we were in a war and we started taking casualties? If we lost 10,000 soldiers in 1 year, how many parents do you think would be recommending to their son or daughter to go join the U.S. military, right? And that's sort of the thinking in the back of the Russians' mind is, if you can get the U.S. in a prolonged conflict, maybe maybe there's a chance of success there. And why is that? Because we'll talk about it, but so in the Russian view, you could have a tactical failure but a strategic success if you can keep that conflict going along. If you can attrit the U.S. military, you can attrit these Western countries, then you have to make those countries make a very difficult decision: either stop fighting or mobilize your citizenry. Think how much institutional resistance we'd have right now if we did a draft. And if we got into a large conflict with the Russians, I'm not saying there would be a draft, but if we were not successful with our immediate objectives, it could become into a prolonged conflict. And if it starts going out months or years, we could definitely see ourselves in a situation where we have recruiting potential problem. Does that make sense? So I know I'm going a little bit over time. Can you go to the next slide, please? Whew. Sorry, that was a mouthful. I try to get it into about 20
You're fine.
minutes.
You're at 20 minutes, about to be 21.
Okay, I think I got it. So you got kind of the narrative of what the Russians are looking at, and kind of their lessons learned. So there are lessons learned about UAVs and little stuff on the ground, but there's also bigger picture lessons learned that the Russians are taking from this conflict, and some of them, I don't think they're in the U.S. interest. Subject to your questions.
All right, Chuck, thank you very much. It's a fascinating insight into not just what we can expect about the future, but especially like how much ideology, still factors in and is still like a key heavyweight in these decisions that the Russians are making. But I know that your comments has generated a number of questions from our guests here today. But first, we want all of you to talk amongst yourselves, compare your impressions, and as a group, come up with some questions for Chuck. Come up with 3 or 4 that you want, because somebody else might take some of your questions. The way we're going to do this is first put you into groups of about 3 people each, so that you can talk about what you've just heard. And then as a group, come up with a few questions you would like to ask Chuck. So please pick a spokesperson to ask the questions on behalf of your group. And we're going to give you 6 minutes in this breakout room to do that. And after we bring you back, we'll be starting with group 1. And then we're going to give you, Taylor, how many minutes are we giving each group?
Looks like we have time for 6. I mean, that's fine.
Okay.
We're doing groups of 6. That's fine. Groups of 3.
All
That's
right,
fine.
that sounds great. So we'll give you about 6 minutes each, and you'll be able to ask your questions directly to Chuck, have an engagement with him, and get those answers. So your questions are getting answered. And then we're going to switch to group 2. You're going to have the same amount of time, and so on. To ensure we're mindful of everyone's time, Taylor is going to keep track of our time for us and let you know when we're about 30 seconds out from the end of your group. So please take advantage of this opportunity to talk to Dr. Bartles. Does anyone have any questions before we send you off to your breakout rooms? Okay, not seeing any. Elise, are we ready to go?
All right,
everybody.
Here you go.
Okay, see you soon.
Hello, anybody there? I see there's 3 of us, but Carol and Diane, you're in mute and no video. Can you hear me? You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Oh, there we are.
Oh, I didn't realize you had to hit OK at the top of the screen.
Right. Dan, can you, or Carol rather, can you unmute yourself? All right. Well, we'll see if Carol can join us or not. She's definitely there, but hiding. Anyhow, that was a pretty good, solid presentation on a topic we know very little about. I really appreciated that. How did you enjoy that?
Well, Matt, it aligns with much of what I've already heard. So that was great to hear that. I know that so much of the will to fight is extremely important on any side in the war. And it was really interesting to hear it again from the Russian side. I've been following the Ukrainian war very, very closely. and I'm very, very concerned. I have friends and family in Europe, and they're all really, really concerned. And of course, having the will to support the Ukrainians is extremely important. So that was really good to hear that the Russians are all in there. I know they're in a wartime economy right now and have committed a substantial proportion of their overall economy to supporting the war. So that is absolutely the truth.
Yeah. I had a couple of questions I thought we could put on the table, which she didn't cover. One of them is an understanding of the force structure of the Russian army. I'm ex-military. My understanding is that there is no NCO rank in Russia, that it's either some lieutenant and then everybody else, but there's nobody in the middle. Are you familiar with any of that?
Yeah, I've heard that they have a plethora of generals, and they really do not allow in-time adjustments to action.
Delegate.
So, yeah, to delegate. And I'm not from a military background, but I'm just passing on
Yeah, it sounds like
information that I've learned.
It sounds like you're tuned in. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that he didn't mention, which I think would be, I mean, obviously this is more having to do with the types of the material that the Russians have to work with compared to what the material that the Ukrainians have to work with. I think is really, really interesting. And one thing that he didn't mention was hybrid warfare. It's the type of warfare that you can commit to another country but doesn't bring you to a hot war. If you can just disrupt their ability to control their infrastructure and so on. They can't do bank transactions or whatever, telecommunication. That I think that's a clear and present experience at this point.
Yeah, and that rolls over perhaps to the question about rules of war, whether or not they follow any convention whatsoever, bombing schools, bombing hospitals, flattening cities. In other words, going after targets which have little to do with warfare, but have a lot to do with just ordinary folk hanging around. An issue that he didn't cover also is the nuclear threat is a diplomatic, strategic, whatever, and it's constantly used by Putin, and nobody's called him on it, and it seems effective. It seems as though it's a scaredy cat kind of thing, and we're the scaredy cats, and I don't know. We respond very nicely every time he opens his mouth and uses the word nuclear. I'd like to see what his input or his insight is to what that's all about, because that may be their primary weapon, actually, of all the stuff they might have in their arsenal.
Yeah, and you can cry wolf so many times before you're going to have to change your tune or else just stop. Right. He did move missiles into Belarus, which is much closer to Germany and Poland and every place else. So, he's making some strategic moves, which is fairly threatening.
It looks like we're going to get knocked off in 4 seconds. You want to take charge and respond to?
No, you can.
Wonderful. I am so looking forward to hearing everybody's questions as they come up. So welcome back. And we want, who is our representative for group number 1?
Me, Chet. So
okay, Jack, go for it. Go ahead and ask your question to Chuck.
We have a question. We have 2 questions. Question number 1, what is the casualty rate of Ukrainians versus Russians? And number 1. Number 2, Trump said that he's going to end the war when he gets elected. What do you see that end the war, how he's going to do that? What do you see, how do we go about ending that war? So that's the two questions we have.
Yeah, the casualty rate, I don't know what the casualty rate is. We know that the Russians have been building new hospitals, to deal with their wounded servicemen. They've been very tight-lipped, both Ukrainians and the Russians have been very tight-lipped about what their casualty rates are. So I don't know exactly how many they've had. I mean, they've had a lot, but if I had to guess, I would guess that, like, in terms of killed in action, for the Russians, I would guess far less than 300,000. You hear some, wild estimates between 300,000 to 500,000, but I'm guessing guessing less than 300,000. And I will just put that in perspective. Every year, the Russians get about 300,000 young men come and join the military, conscripted into the military. So, people talk about the Russians or even the Ukrainians running out of manpower. But, they've only lost 300,000 so far. I mean, it's a lot of people, don't get me wrong. But every year, the Russians induct 300,000. So there's a lot more gas in the tank there, unfortunately, to continue the conflict. And then, how would President Trump stop the war? I have no idea what that would look like. I mean, obviously, if they stopped funding the Ukrainians, like I talked about, in order to continue to fight, you have to have two things pretty much: the will to fight, which I mentioned, and you also need the material means to fight. So you got to have those two things, right? And the Ukrainians definitely have the will to fight. I'm not sure if the Ukrainians have the material resources to keep on going. The material industrial base for the Ukrainians was all mostly in eastern Ukraine, and the eastern Ukraine has been devastated. The Russians wanted to annex and add all those assets to their territory. But they've all been destroyed now, right? The place is in utter ruin. So that's where all that, it used to be like bringing coal to Newcastle, bringing weapons into Ukraine, because Ukraine was a huge arms exporter until 2022. They had a huge arms industry in Ukraine. So I'm not sure what President Trump could do to end the conflict. Just personally, I don't know. I mean, the Ukrainians are going to keep on fighting, and I think the Russians are also heavily invested, right? I don't think Putin can stop until he's taken Kiev, Odessa, and that whole seaboard up to Transnistria. So I can't see any reason why they would. It doesn't really matter what goes on here in the United States. They both have their political objectives. So
you indicated that the Russians. You said that Ukrainians still have will to fight, even if they may not have a material, they have a will to fight. Who has a greater will to fight, Ukrainians or Russians?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, if which Russians, which Ukrainians, if you talk to the ethnic Russians that live in eastern Ukraine, I mean, they hate those Ukrainians as much as most Ukrainians hate Russians right now. I mean, in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk, those ethnic Russians that growing up there, General Toplinsky, he's the airborne troops commander for the Russians right now. He grew up in I think it was Donetsk, and he cannot stand cannot stand the Ukrainians. So there's a lot of animosity there, and I don't know who's got the stronger will. I mean, I think the Ukrainians understand that if they're not successful here, they're going to cease to function as a country, and so. Yeah, I don't have a good guess for you on who's got a stronger will to fight. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the West is losing their will to fight. Definitely. I think USA and some other countries are losing will to fight. And I think that's going to somewhat maybe flow to Ukrainians eventually when they don't have a material.
So we're getting off topic, but I think part of the deal with funding Ukraine didn't have anything to do with whether you agreed what was going on in Ukraine or not. It kind of got wrapped into what's going on the southern border here, right? So that those two kind of issues got wrapped up to each other. Didn't have really much to do with. I think most Americans support the Ukrainians, but there was this issue about what was going on the border and then that money that was wrapped up with that. But yeah,
that's it.
Okay. Well, let's move on then to Group 2. Group 2, who is your representative or your spokesperson? And what questions do you have?
I don't know what group I was in.
Same here.
Group 2 was actually that was Bud. You were Group 2. I've got you showing as Group 2.
Chuck, you're in trouble. First of all, group 2 consisted of 2 of us, and the other fellow bailed out fairly early. So this is pretty much my question, and it deals, Chuck, with your assumption about the will to fight within the populace of Russia. Russia obviously is huge, and when you talk about the ethnic variations and the value systems within all these ethnic systems that are independent of one another, I know we have gulags in Russia, and I know that there is an overarching threat, if you will, that everybody is going to play the game. What is your opinion of the chances of some kind of breakdown for Putin and his desire to have a Russian will to fight within the population?
Yeah, so you talk about some of the ethnic diversity there, but if you look at Russia, it's definitely a multi-ethnic. You think United States is a multi-ethnic country? Russia is definitely a multi-ethnic country. If you look at your average Ukrainian that's out there fighting, I'd say it's generally a white guy, right? But if you look at your Russians, you see all different types of nationalities: Buryats, Kalmuks, Tatars. There's a big variety of people there. So it's not just about white Orthodox males out there fighting. It's kind of this. There's a sense of Russia both as a ethnic group, right, and then Russia as a country. And a lot of these non-ethnic Russians, these different 148 nationalities or whatever that live within Russia. There's a lot of feelings that they're still Russians, and they're ethnic, not ethnically Russian, but it's a country, right? So they have I'd say there is a strong national component to it. And if you look at some of the worst atrocities, around Bakhmut and some of these areas weren't committed by ethnic Russians. There were these, Buryats, these guys, Tibetan, more of Asian descent people that were from Buryatia region in Russia. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think they're going to break down. I mean, not all Russians are for what's going on there. I don't speak for all Russians. There's definitely Russians that are not jazzed about what's going on there. The problem where you don't hear a lot from them is one of the things the Russians did in the very early days when there were protests. Like if they rolled up any men that were protesting, those men, as soon as they got released from prison, they got their conscription notice for the front. So, got rolled up, and then as soon as right when they were released, they were carted off to serve. So that's different. But generally right now, there's definitely not all Russians are supportive, but I would say as a whole, I'd say Russians are very supportive. I know a lot of ethnic Russians that have been here in the United States for 20, 30 years and are very pro-Putin.
Okay.
It's not like they're brainwashed. Yeah. So
thank you very much.
Okay. Since Bud was by himself, we're going to move on then to room 3. Luis, Mike, Pat, who is your spokesperson? What questions do you have?
I'm not sure who our spokesperson is. Mr. Orlando, would you like to?
We didn't elect a spokesperson. I had a viewpoint and some questions. If it's okay, I can ask those questions.
Definitely.
Okay. Does the rest of my group agree with that?
Sure.
Okay. Yep. I kind of get that Chuck said that Russia is a bottomless pit of resources, and we're not because of the will to fight. And Marsheimer, there's more than 2 guys, but I look at Marsheimer and Paul Post. And Marsheimer says Russia is likely to accept keep the eastern area, Crimea, and Paul Post says if we walk away, they'll want to take everything all the way up to England, and for sure Poland. And I like Marsheimer more than I like Paul Post. Now, there are other Paul Post people. There aren't any other Mersheimers that really agree with Mersheimers. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so in general, the Russians have this concept. It's like Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and I don't know exactly what Putin has in mind, but he sees the borders of Russia as they should be, not as they are right now, and the borders of Russia as he sees them, I'm not exactly sure what they look like, but wherever there is ethnically speaking Russian or ethnic Russian population. So if you look around Russia's borders, there are a lot of ethnic Russians are outside of Russia, and I think those are the areas that Putin would be interested in. So think about some areas in Estonia, right? If you look at the eastern end of Estonia by Tartu, that's mostly all ethnic Russian. If you look at the northern area of Kazakhstan, ethnic Russians. But do I think Putin wants to go all the way to, the UK? No, absolutely not. I don't think he's interested in going to Germany. I don't think he's interested in, I don't think he's interested in Western Ukraine. I think he just wants the Russian-speaking areas. So I know Marsheimer very well, and I don't really agree with a lot of his viewpoints. He's definitely well-respected academic, but I don't think they're going to stop in Eastern Ukraine. I think they're going to keep on going for this Ruski Mir, this Russian world that they see it, and it may not go right away, but remember, everybody said they wouldn't go anything after they took Crimea in 2014. They said they were going to stop there, right? And then it's been going on since 2022. So. Yeah, I don't know exactly what he's going to do, but I would be very surprised that if he took Eastern Ukraine, that's where this all stops. I'd be very surprised.
A follow on or
go ahead?
The time. Well, the situation of whether if he were offered that, and considering what if indeed Trump does win this time. I suspect that we could have another 12 years of relative peace before the Russian lion wakes up. And then by that time, both Putin and the guy, his brain trust, I can't drop his name, Paul Pugrin or what's his name? You probably know the name, but you know who I mean. He's written books that were translated into the U.S. about Russian.
Gerasimov? No. It's his daughter got killed.
It's a two-syllable name. That's almost that doesn't even sound right. Yeah. Alexander Dubrin, is that the name?
Yeah, he's kind of even in Russia he's kind of a marginal. He's very popular here, or a lot of people know he is here, but he's kind of a marginal character in Russia. To be honest with you.
Okay. I do know Russian people that I've known for the whole time, and until this began, I didn't realize that they said they are not really Russian; they're Ukrainian. And I've known some of them for 12 years, and some of them have been scientists that have come here, and they never admitted they were Russian. They were Ukrainian until after this started. So I don't know that it's monolithic, just as we're not monolithic. What do you think about that?
I mean, yeah, if you're ethnic Ukrainian, you're definitely not jazzed about what's going on there. The problem is there's a lot of ethnic Russians that live in Eastern Ukraine, and that's the part of that population that's really fired up. And even in the 90s, there was a group of Ukrainians that tried to secede from Ukraine and Crimea. They wanted to secede for Russia, and kind of got shot down both by the Ukrainians and by the Russians. The Russians didn't want to deal with it, but I mean, there's a lot of Russians that live in Ukraine that want to be part of Crimea, or I'm sorry, part of Russia.
Well, I thank
One
you.
other quick question from our group was, what, in your opinion, would NATO have to do to really turn the tide? What has to be done?
I mean, yeah, what would NATO have to do? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm definitely not a fan of direct NATO involvement, but I'm not sure. I mean, I have no idea. I have no idea what you could do to turn the tide back in favor of the Ukrainians. You got to remember the Russian army is so much bigger right now than the Ukrainian. It wasn't that way when the war first started, right? It took a while for the Russians to do that partial mobilization, but I'm not exactly sure what the how they can cease hostilities in a way that's favorable for the Ukrainians. Remember, the Russians are the aggressors, right? So they have to stop fighting. They have to be the ones that voluntarily withdraw, right? And I can't see any situation other than regime change there in Russia where the current administration would decide to stop fighting.
Okay, with that one, I think we're going to move on to room 4. Aaron, Michael, Peter, what question?
Yeah, so Michael, I know you had a question, so do you want to have yours, and then I have one after you.
And I might have one as well.
Okay. Oh, sure. You can go before me.
My question was, do you think that the military aid for Ukraine that was already pledged and beginning to come will be enough to change the course of the war and to break this stalemate? Or Ukraine will need more?
Ukraine's definitely going to need more. Yeah, they're definitely going to need more. I mean, lots more, and for a prolonged period, for years.
And if more, then what kind of aid?
Remember, Ukraine's military industry has pretty much been destroyed. So, I mean, they're going to need everything. They're going to need they're going to need everything that an army needs to fight is going to have to be provided. I realize they have had some success with reducing stuff in Western Ukraine. They moved some stuff out to Lviv in the Western Ukraine, but it's going to be a year's process if they come out successful. It's not going to stop anytime soon.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. My question is, I would think it would be unrealistic to expect Russia to eventually abandon Crimea, since it's been one of their 2 largest naval bases, and they've had it for 200 years or more, I understand. They don't want to give that up, just like the United States is in Guantanamo. I guess we would not want to give that up. But do you see, or how would you envision some final peace settlement based on the way it looks like things are going?
I mean, I can't see why either one of those sides would settle right now, because neither side has what they want. The Ukrainians want to have their territory back, which I think they're entitled to, and the Russians want the Ukrainian territory. I don't see a middle ground, on solving that. Now, I think the Russians would take a ceasefire. I think they would take a ceasefire, but they would be back at it as soon as they were reconstituted enough where they thought they were successful. They would be back at it, clawing that stuff back. But I think the Russians believe that Eastern Ukraine is rightfully theirs, and they're going to do whatever they can to take it. So yeah, I can't see any. One side's going to have to capitulate.
Okay.
I don't see much of a ceasefire coming.
I have a question also. Thank you, Chuck, for a great presentation, and just for being here in this kind of forum. My question is, the U.S. and Western allies have been very reluctant to support the development of organic Ukrainian air power. I think in principle, because of the prior fear or their view that they wanted to have a limited contained fight within the constituted Ukrainian territory. That seems to be finally gone. Do you see over the next 2 to 3 years the Ukrainians being able to develop the scale, right, the number of squadrons and wings that would be needed to actually challenge the position that the Russians have in terms of air control and near air dominance? Is that because I think that might be one aspect of the conflict that starts generating extremely high costs for the Russians, because obviously replacing MiGs is not cheap, and pilots, and the Russians need them for more than just the fight in Ukraine, right? They need them to be a global power. So I'm just wondering, how do you see the the air contestation phase evolving, and do you think that's an area that if you get to a real stalemate, that could change the approach the Russians take to the whole conflict?
Yeah, I'm not sure. The Russians have pretty robust air defense systems, so yeah, I'm surprised that the Ukrainian Air Force has lasted as long as it has. And then the other problem with any kind of putting aircraft in at scale is where are you going to park those aircraft? Because they got to sit someplace, they have to be serviced someplace, and the Russians, whatever problems they've had fairly good cruise missiles and different kind of missile technology. Now they're using these cheaper Iranian UAVs, kind of cheap cruise missiles, and they've really been able to penetrate. They've hit Lviv, they've hit out in western Ukraine. So they need aviation. I'm not sure what that's going to look like of bringing in a bunch of more aircraft, and how. I'm not sure what kind of scale you would need. How many hundreds of aircraft you would need, or if it'd have to be measured in hundreds or tens before you'd actually make a difference. And I'm not an air power guy. I do mostly ground power, so I don't have a good guess on what that would look like. Sorry.
No, thank you. One quick little follow up. So the Russians and the Ukrainians have accepted this enormous line of control, this 1,000-kilometer front. Can maybe you talk a little bit about how that just fundamentally, from an air-land battle doctrine perspective, just completely constrains the fight, because everything is so spread out. You have to have so much defense in depth so that you can't move more than a few kilometers, even if you have whatever someone wants to call a breakthrough, because you don't have any density. There's no mass.
Yeah, so right now the Russians are what we call in a traditional positional defense, a doctrinal positional defense. So usually positional defense, you see multiple lines, and then in front of those lines, you'd see 30 to 40 kilometers of kind of defensive works. They call it a security area or security defensive zone in front of the lines. And when the Ukrainians did their big push last year, they were not able to break through even the first of those lines. The Russians, for whatever problem they've had on the offense, one thing we kind of learned from the war is, when people are defending, it's hard to break through, right? It is hard because, there's all these mines out there, and then before you get the mines, you have to, send out, before you send in troops or equipment, or whatever, you have to remove the mines. And it's a big problem. So it's not just a problem for the Russians and Ukrainians. I think it would be a problem for the U.S. if we were engaged with the Russians, because we'd have to go through these similar defensive lines. Think if the Russians took a piece of territory and we tried taking it back. And I think it's a lot more difficult to do these offensive operations we thought. The other problem is with all these UAVs, there's almost ubiquitous ISR that's observation that's covering the battlefield. So it's very difficult to move unbeknownst to the enemy. And that's particularly the problem for the U.S. military. The U.S. Army is that these thermal imagers that they have on the drones, the U.S. Army likes to fight at night. That's when we've done our best work, is at night, because other armies can't do that. But if you look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine right now, these guys don't move a lot at night because they're so easy to see with thermal imagers on the UAVs, on the unmanned aerial vehicles. You stick out, especially on a cold night. Your body heat just radiates with these thermal imagers. So been a lot of changes in terms of that kind of thing.
Okay, I want to move on to group 5 now, room 5. So Bill, Glenn, Greg, what questions do you have?
Well, this is Bill. We didn't elect the leader and we didn't elect any questions, but I'll be happy to go first and then anybody else can go after me. So I wonder if you would care to speculate on what would happen if the Democrats win the election versus if the Republicans win the election. My guess is that if the Democrats win the election, their name is written all over this. They're just going to keep going the way we've been going, and the two sides are going to slog it out and slog it out and slog it out. If the Republicans win the election, they're probably going to say, we got 3 things going against us. Number one, we can't have a strategy because we've got too many players. We've got the United States, we've got Ukraine, and we've got all the European countries, and you can't have a strategy when you don't have somebody sitting in the driver's seat. Secondly is we've watched our World War II documentaries about the Russians in World War II in Stalingrad, and we know that the Russians can take blow after blow after blow after blow after blow and still come back and fight. And, we're just not like that. And by the way, they've got China in back of them and they've got North Korea in back of them. And number three is it's really hard to win when Russia is free to invade Ukraine to the extent that it can, but we're not free to invade Russia to whatever extent we can. So I'm Donald Trump and I'm going to get with Putin and we're going to draw a line and Putin's going to say, yes, I'll go with that. And Zelensky is going to say, shit, I guess we got to go with that. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the political stuff, I'm a Russian military analyst, so I don't follow the political stuff. I don't know. I mean, I just now probably be out of my area to kind of speculate on what would happen with the presidential change administration.
But was that an accurate assessment of the strategic difficulties, the exhaustion factor, and the inability to invade the other guy's turf?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the nuclear thing. So, I mean, we have kind of the same thing, right? That's why, the nuclear thing's always in play with the Russians. But talk about the second point you're talking about of casualties. The Russians don't have they can't expend casualties like they did in the World War II, right? Remember, in World War II, it was the Soviet Union. It wasn't just the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia. So, there's only 150 million people in Russia right now. So they can't just bleed people like they did back in the day. But one of the things that we kind of learned is, I didn't get to it on the briefing, but we talked about the different casualty rates between the U.S. and the Russians. And one of the things that the Russians, what kind of guides the way they do tactics is Russians like having simpler tactics, right? The U.S. military, we have called mission command, and non-commissioned officers kind of lead the way. In the Russian military, it's not like that. It's very top down and it's very simplified command and control. And the first year of the battle, we saw the Ukrainians have a lot of success against the Russians, tactically, right? But in the last year, the Russians seem to be pulling ahead of the Ukrainians in terms of tactics. They seem to be doing just as well, and if not better than than Ukrainians in terms of tactics. And why might that be? And my opinion is these Ukrainians that were trained by the West, we not just us, but the UK invested a lot into training the Ukrainian military, developing a Western style NCO corps. These guys have all been killed off or maimed or just out of the fight, right? So now we're down we used to have our A team that was out there fighting. Now we're down to the B and honestly the C team, both for Ukrainians and for the Russians. And with the Russian way of war, it is all about winning with the C team, right? The U.S., we don't take a lot of casualties. We can develop officers and non-commissioned officers and have institutional memory. For the way the Russians fight, after what they've learned in World War II, is your lifespan on the battlefield is going to be very short. You need to have short, simple tactics. And what we see right now in Ukraine is I think both the Russians and the Ukrainians have had to kind of resort back to more of this Soviet way of fighting because there's not a lot of institutional memory there. A lot of these people are being killed off. So it's just a way of rolling through the punches.
Glenn,
okay. Can I, I'd like to ask a question because it seems to me that right now, Russian population is about 150 million and Ukrainian population is greatly diminished to maybe like between 20 and 30 million. So, and it's an attrition war. So it is inevitable that if everything continues like that, that the Russia is going to grind more and more Ukraine. I mean, it's a matter of time, and that's how the Russians see it as well. So the question is, I also wanted to say that early in the war, the United States provided those systems called HIMARS, right? And they were extremely successful. However, they provided, I think, only 16 or maybe 18, something around 20 max of those systems, while the United States has a few thousands of them that are probably, and a lot more equipment that the United States is probably already too old and just doing nothing. So I mean, I think it's a shame that why you need to make even money. Why not provide that at least some of it? So the question is, like, what would it take for the West to wake up to what's happening right now? Because it reminds the beginning of the World War II so much if you don't do anything. And I'm talking about West Europe and the United States. And my understanding that European military complex is not developed sufficiently, while Russian economy is completely on the war rails.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know much about U.S. arms industry. It's not my forte. But just working around the Army, I know some of the problem is that we're not signing long-term contracts for these munitions. So we want to buy ammunition and stuff and send it to Ukraine, but we don't want to sign long-term contracts, right, with the arms manufacturers. So if you want to do industrial-sized warfare, you need multiple production lines set up, and those production lines are expensive to set up. And these our manufacturers don't want to set up those production lines if they're going to go cold in 2 years, right? So there's a big expenditure to set up those. So the demand signal has not been there from the my understanding from the kind of the Western governments, both the U.S. and the Europeans, is to increase capacity. So they're running what we have at capacity. So for the HIMARS, we've given the Ukrainians some HIMARS launchers, right? But the problem is not the amount of launchers they have; it's the amount of munitions that they can launch from the launchers. So that's been the big problem. And the U.S. has not been on a war footing in a long time, and we just don't have those munitions. Now, we have given the Ukrainians some stuff that was going out of date. Like if you look at the anti-tank guided missile systems, the lost systems. I know we had a bunch of stuff that was getting ready to go out of date that we'd made in the 90s for the Cold War, and they'd given all that stuff to the Ukrainians already. But I don't know. There's a production issue, right? It's not just the U.S. military, the U.S. government. There needs to be a demand signal to expand the lines of production.
But isn't that there is a demand, considering that where it's going? It seems like it's in a trajectory. It's pretty clear.
There's a demand, right? So, I mean, the U.S. would like to buy, let's say 1 million rounds of artillery shells and give them 1 million rounds. And if you can only make 10,000 rounds, a month, there's no way you can make those 1 million rounds. And if you want to make them, if you want to have enough capacity to make those 1 million rounds in, a year, you would have to spend a huge amount of money to increase your industrial capacity, right? Say the production line, let's say the production line costs, $20 million to set up. That's the problem. They need to set up more production line to increase the capacity. Sounds like the U.S. government would love to buy that stuff and give it to them, but the capacity is not there. And that's why you need a long-term contract.
All right. I have a question to you, because you're a military analyst. Do you think that it is important to right now to increase the production? Because considering that they're going to have to me, it seems that the United States will have to do it anyway at some point because the way it's developing.
Can you make this a response brief, because we'll have to move on to the other groups, Chuck? Good.
Yeah, I think there's the possibility of conflict with Russia in the near future is high.
Okay. I want to move on to room 6 to respect your time for the event tonight. So Carol, Diane, Steve, what questions do you have?
Steve here. Thank you so much for this very illuminating presentation. We do have 4 issues. I'll just summarize the 4. You can hit them all in one shot. The first is your view on the effectiveness of NATO and its role in this whole process. The second is the constant crying of wolf by Putin using his nuclear threat. How should we read that? I think people tend to hear it and it goes out their ear and that's it. The third one is, does Russia subscribe to any rules of war? I mean, bombing hospitals and schools and devastating civilian areas is sort of normal for them. And not only that, but the landmines issue. So there are a lot of rules of war issues on the table. And nobody seems to be talking about that. The last item has to do with what I'll call hybrid warfare, where the internet, non-lethal technologies and all that stuff that's pervasive in the world, Russia seems to be a past master at illuminating their side of the story. So that's our summary of 4 items. And thanks again.
Yeah, for NATO, I mean, it's important we don't get directly involved. Russians say that the U.S. is directly involved, but I do think it's important, for this thing doesn't escalate. And I think NATO is doing everything it can. Obviously the U.S. has provided a lot of weapons, and not just weapons, but I think I don't know too much about it, but I think there's also providing coordinates of different targets for them to be targeted by the Ukrainians. That's one of the reasons I think the Ukrainians look very successful vis-a-vis the Russians, because we're giving them the locations of these things to blow up. And in relation to the nuclear thing, I mean, I don't know. The nuclear thing is kind of what keeps NATO directly out of the conflict, right? We can't engage directly in the conflict because there's this very high possibility of nuclear escalation. And then, even before this conflict started, there was no way, just the size of NATO compared to Russia, if you had all your NATO members, I mean, it dwarfs the military of Russia. There's no way they can win. The only way they can, win against either Russia, or I'm sorry, either against NATO or China is with nuclear weapons in a conflict, right? So they really need that. As far as of how effective it's been, they kind of wag the tail a little bit on the nuclear weapons, but I don't know. There's been some debate if how effective they have been. The Russians have had some quote unquote red lines that have definitely been crossed. They said if you throw us out of SWIFT, the banking system, they declared that as a direct action of war, right? And they got thrown out of SWIFT. They had a bunch of other things, had money taken from it, had a bunch of other things that made them really angry. All those lines are crossed, and they really didn't do anything, right? They didn't escalate. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much the nuclear thing is really doing for them. Obviously they need that to keep NATO out of the conflict, but I don't think it's doing a whole lot more for them. It's not stopping us from giving them stuff to hit inside of Russia. The Ukrainians have some capability to do that now. In terms of the rules of war, don't get me wrong, the Russians have definitely destroyed some stuff that they shouldn't have destroyed. I'm not always sure how intentional some of those things are. Like, sometimes these things just miss, and then sometimes when Ukrainians when they try to shoot down these missiles and rockets that are coming into Ukraine, sometimes these things can miss and hit targets they're not intended to. The other thing is I don't know exactly what's going on there, but if you have combatants that are in a given building, even if it's a hospital, even if it's a church, synagogue, mosque, whatever, that becomes a lawful target for law of land warfare. So I don't know exactly what's going on there, but it's war. Things get crazy, and I wouldn't point the dirty end of the stick at the Russians for that. I'm not exactly sure what goes on. I don't think they're intentionally trying to murder the population. I think that's just the way they fight. If you have if you have military forces that are in the urban environment, you can go building to building, or you can just destroy those buildings. And for the Russians, it's just easier as a military to destroy those buildings. And as for hybrid warfare, I don't think the Russians do hybrid warfare. They don't do it like as a doctrine, but I don't really think they're really good at projecting their view of what's going on. If you look at, I don't know if you heard of Russia Today, RT. It's a news channel. If some of you may have on your cable providers, it may have that TV station on there. I really don't know. I watch it because I kind of follow what's going on in Russia. I don't know really anybody that doesn't follow Russia that watches that channel, right? And that's supposed to be this network that's out there to kind of change Americans' minds. I don't know any American that watches that network. They put millions of dollars into it, and it's not really effective. So, they definitely have a narrative that they push, but I don't think they're any better at this than the U.S. is. Did I get it?
Right. Thank you. Target.
All right, we're going to move on to room 7. So, Frank, Martha, Tim, what questions do you have?
Hi. Hey, Colonel. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. We have found it quite valuable. Because you've answered the questions so thoroughly, most of what we discussed in our group you've covered, because we were concerned about replenishing American hardware and if that was valid. And you've also shared kind of what you see as the outcome for Ukraine and for Russia. since you have such a strong point of view of how the Russians see things, what would they expect to be a possible outcome to get the U.S. and EU out of this conflict, to settle things with Ukraine, and to save their own face as they wrap this up? How does this whole conflict end, in your opinion?
Yeah, for the Russians, I don't see any middle ground. I see either they, like I said, either they take Kiev, Odessa, that seaboard, and up to Transnistria, maybe even into Transnistria. But I don't see any other way that they can't go that route, because it put a lot of money, but they've explicitly talked about still taking Kiev and Odessa. So anything less than that, I think it would look like failure. And if you know anything about Russian history, if you're Russian czar, and if you fail in a war, things get bad for you pretty quick. And I think that kind of in the back of Putin's head. There's a lot of, and people say, hey, when Putin goes, things are probably going to be a lot better. There's a lot of kind of ugly nationalism in Russia. I don't know if whoever comes along after Putin is going to be any more friendlier to kind of that Western way of Western view than what we got right now. So I don't know if that's going to be an improvement or actually make things a lot worse. But I can't see any kind of stopping point for the Russians. Now, I could see them doing a temporary pause, like signing a peace treaty. But I think a year or two after it, there would be some sort of provocation, and they would be right back at it, trying to take those goals of Kiev, Odessa, and that seaboard. There's no way, they've got too much skin in the game. And, talk about sanctions, they can't be any more sanctioned, or, they really can't be. There's no more negative for them, right? So why not go all in and take this thing? So I don't see a lot of middle ground for them.
Okay, I'm going to move us on then to room 9. So Al, Gail, Rosemary, what questions do you have for Chuck? Al, you're muted if you're talking to us. There you go.
It should be okay now. Okay. Two quick questions. If Zelensky somehow was killed, is there someone next up who Ukrainians would turn to? And the second question is, how is the Russian economy really doing, and how bad would it have to get to put such a demand to the end of the war that Putin would have to do something?
Yeah, so for Zelensky, I can't remember the former chief of staff of the armed forces, what his name was, but he was very popular. And I could definitely see if something happened to Zelensky, I could see somebody like, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but
Zaluzny.
Zaluzny. Yeah, I could see somebody like Zaluzny coming in, and not Syrskyi, not the current, but I could definitely see somebody coming in and taking over, because the Ukrainians, they understand what's at stake if they lose this. So, I mean, you see Ukrainian women volunteering to fight, because they all understand that if the Russians are successful here, the country's pretty much over, and it's not a happy time for them. So I think there's a national will to fight there. So I think they would find a leader. And then in terms of Russian economy, I'm not an economist, but I do work with Richard Conley. He's he's out of the UK. He's a well-known Russian military economist. But when we talk about Russian economy, one of the things that really impacted the Russians was the 2008 economic crisis. And after the 2008 economic crisis, one of the things Russia decided was going to do was kind of divest from the world economy. So in case there was another crisis, I don't know if you had any personal impact from 2008, but a lot of people outside of the U.S. were heavily impacted by that, especially in the former Soviet Union. And one of the things the Russians decided to do was kind of divest from the world economy. So in case something happened, it wasn't going to impact them as much. And one of the things the Russians did, if you talk to the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the Russians before this conflict were like a poster child, right? They had low debt, high income, and low deficit, very little debt, and they were very successful. And the Russians focused, instead of growing, most Western countries focus on growing the economy. The Russians focused on making it insolent and protective. So when this crisis did happen, it wasn't, even after the sanctions, it wasn't as big a problem for them as most other countries. And remember, the Russians, they get a lot of their money from fossil fuel exports, but in the last few years, even before the conflict, they're actually pulling in more money from tax revenue than they were from oil imports. So the economy there is doing well. I think in the last 3 years, they've had 1 million new small businesses established in Russia. One of the reasons is that the Russians have kind of tightened the leash a little bit on regulations there. So there's been a lot of new businesses that have been stood up, and now they're having a labor shortage due to all the men being sucked out, and either not just in the fighting in the special military operation, but also in that war industry, because there's a lot of spending going on for the war industry. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think the Russian economy is going to collapse anytime soon, but if they wouldn't have invaded Crimea in 2014, I think the Russians would have a very, very strong economy right now and would be, doing very, very well. But, they made a couple of political decisions in the last, 20 years or last 10 years have not done well for them. But as an economy, they aren't going to, I don't see them collapsing anytime soon.
Al, do you have any more from your team?
I have a quick question. We were very disorganized, so if Val has another question, go ahead. But I was going to ask, and I was surprised to hear you say that the Russians were prepared for a long war, and we don't seem to be prepared for anything. I mean, for any sacrifice. I mean, even the money begins to sort of make everybody upset. And I'm wondering about your view of that, because it seems pretty pessimistic, as is mine, about what is going to happen next. I mean, if Russia succeeds, and it appears that it will, and at least I've heard one analysis that even if they were to settle and take the eastern part of the country and keep Crimea, Ukraine wouldn't be economically viable anyway, because it's lost chunks of it's an industry, and also I think it's agriculture. So, I mean, like, what next? It seems to me that our lackadaisical response, I don't really think we would have given any money at all if the Ukrainians hadn't been so valiant in the beginning. And I think that has stirred up everything else. So,
yeah, just to clarify, they were not prepared for the long war when they went in. They thought it was going to be, Crimea 2014. They thought they were just going to walk in and things. But it was after that first month. Then the messaging to the population was this is going to be a long war, and you need to start preparing for it. And they use the term partial mobilization, but the economy started. They started kind of retooling the economy for, I wouldn't say a wartime footing, but, for wartime production. They started bringing back facilities online, increasing, production, more production lines. So that's what they started to do. And I don't think we've done that in the West, right? But, is there more industrial capacity in the West than there is in Russia? Yeah, absolutely. But like I said, there's got to be a demand signal from, the governments that, these production facilities are going to be kept going. You need my personal view is you need long-term contracts with industry to keep that thing going. Remember, the Russians, their industries are quote unquote private, but they're usually company owned. Like Rostec, it's their major arms exporter. It's a private corporation, but the shares are owned by the Russian government. So they have a great deal of control over those. The government has a great deal of control over what industry does there. So in terms of U.S. and the long fight, I don't know. I mean, I'm not to be a topic for somebody else. That's not I'm a Russianist, so that's kind of what I look at. I don't know what the right answer is for the U.S.
I guess what I'm saying is that the Russians presumably have bought into this Russian mir, or whatever it is you call it. The Chinese certainly have bought into the perception that Taiwan belongs to them, and North Korea certainly has the perception that the peninsula should be unified, and they want it to be unified under their control, not under
South Korean.
the odd man out. The West doesn't seem to have any vision, and that's why it seems to me there's no will. I'm just saying that the will factor seems to be the dominant one.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, all right, with those comments, I'd like to move on though to our final room, room 10. Kathy and Scott, what questions do you have?
Kathy, did you want to ask something before I ask mine? Miss Kathy said she'd come in late and everything, so I don't know if she wanted to ask anything.
Say go for it.
Okay. Well, I'll just go. So I'd hate to strike kind of a contrary tone here, but there's been a lot of like pessimistic talk about Ukraine and about the situation there. As a Russian, strategic and military analyst, here's the way I see things, and what I'd like for you to do is after I talk, what my question will be: what am I missing? Where am I going wrong? Russia is getting slaughtered. Their men are being slaughtered. They're going to have to call more up. When they do that, hundreds of thousands more will leave the country, just like they already have. They're getting brain drained. They're getting bled. They're never going to be able to engage NATO because NATO will, as you point out, the correlation of forces is a joke. So, if they keep fighting, and I think we can both agree that Ukraine isn't going to fall down anytime soon. Ukraine is not stupid. They're going to do what they're doing now and target those S-400s, S-300s. They're going to attack more into the infrastructure of Russia, attacking their oil refining capabilities and other high value assets with their different long range weapons they're going to be able to use. And so NATO is getting larger. The world is getting more and more scared and starting to arm and starting to unite. So all of these I see are big losses. Yeah, Russia's economy is doing well because they've been shot with steroids. But as soon as for the strategic long term, that's when all this stuff is going to take an effect on them when the war is over. So what I'm confused about is what's so good about all this for Russia? Why do they want to continue? If they do gain Ukraine, they gain a wasteland and a population that doesn't like you much. So I don't get it. Help me.
I mean, yeah. So as for the population, I mean, if you look in Eastern Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine's ethnic Russians, mostly ethnic Russians, like whatever ethnic Ukrainians have probably left there in Donetsk and Luhansk, those are very pro-Russia areas right now. I mean, they're going to, I think even if Russia stopped fighting, I think those guys would keep on fighting. They're some of the best fighters have come out of that area. And, they definitely have skin in the game. They hate the Ukrainians. So I don't see any way those guys are going to stop fighting. But in terms of slaughter, I mean, I don't know what your casualty estimate, but what do you think how many KIAs do you think the Russians had? Maybe what's your personal estimate?
Oh yeah, that's the thing is a quarter million, I guess, for Russia. But the thing is, what is it for NATO?
Yeah, but yeah, I got it. But let's say
so who cares? I mean,
but not like I said, let's say 300,000. But like I said, 300,000 is how much they induct every year. The Russians are not, I mean, they're having manpower problems. I don't dispute that. But if you look, these conscripts, every year they have 300,000 conscripts that come in and out of service. And they're not using any of that manpower in this fight. So I don't think they're desperate on manpower. The Russians made a conscious decision to do partial military mobilization. instead of using these conscripts. That's a historical abnormality. They've never done that before. Even in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, there was conscripts used in those conflicts. Even in the initial invasion of Afghanistan, special operations, there was conscripts there. This is the first time conscripts have not been used by the Russians. And I think for the Russian population, they understand, like for us, we really don't understand how the Russians are formed, but that makes a big statement to the Russians is the Russians have not had to go in and use these conscripts like they've done in every other war that they've been in. So it's kind of, I think it's a sign of strength for them to their population is that, things are not going bad. And then in terms of the brain drain, yes, a lot of Russians have left the country, but there's been questions about economic impact because they're going abroad and they're working, right? But a lot of them, a lot of these IT guys, that's a lot of them, they're still working for these Russian companies, right? So they may be sitting in Uzbekistan or Latvia or Georgia, but they're still providing that power. They're still providing that brain power and that manpower to those Russian companies that they work for. So, at least for these, like this IT class they talk about that have been, that have exfiltrated from the country. And there hasn't been any more talk of partial mobilization. I haven't heard it. There was a big talk that the Russians would do another partial mobilization after Putin got elected. He got elected a few months ago. Haven't seen any of it. And then in terms of NATO, right now the Russians are licking their wounds, but they're expanding that military to 1.5 million. And I don't know what they have planned after this Ukraine thing, but I don't think they're done fighting. I don't know what they're going to do, but this expansion that they're talking about is brought about by events that's in Ukraine right now, but it's for the future. It's for whatever conflict that they're going to get in next, and they see conflict on the future. In the future, there's no doubt in my mind that they see there's going to be some sort of dust up with NATO here at some point. I don't know when that's going to be, but I think the Russians don't have a doubt. And if you talk to anybody from Poland, if you ever talk to any Poles will tell you, they're going to be at war with the Russians in the next few years. They swear to it. Talk to not just Ukrainian military, or I'm sorry, not just Polish military, but Polish civilians. They are dead set, or they're sure that they're going to be at war. They've been setting up kind of I would say National Guard, but like civilian volunteer corps around the country to fight off a Russian invasion. They're 100% serious on it. So it's not just my opinion, but or kind of a Russianist opinion, but Poles are definitely, and other people are definitely thinking that this thing's going to be coming to them pretty soon.
Well, that's kind of a dark note to end on, but we are. So we do have some important business to finish out with, though. And we want to make sure that these events are as enjoyable as possible. And we want to ask for your help in doing that by filling out our short exit survey. Just point your camera to the QRC code or enter the tiny URL. And Donna and Taylor are also putting that link into the chat right now. I want to extend our invitation to all of our fellow veterans, including, of course, you, Lieutenant Colonel Bartles, to join our Braver Angels military and veterans group and attend our future events. I do want to mention our next event like this is going to be happening on August 15th, where we're going to be looking at the future of wargaming and simulation and what's that is going to look like for our military planning going into the future. So that one should be a good one too. And that is now up on the events for Braver Angels events. I'd also like you to join our team if you do want to join our team and our mission of defending the nation by helping us unite in a meaningful political dialogue. You can reach us at tinyurl.com/MVG-welcome. And join us at our next welcome event, which is going to be this coming Monday, the 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern, and that link is also in the chat. And finally, if you're interested in any of our other Braver Angels events, you can see all those at braverangels.org/events. If you want to copy the chat where all this good information is, you can do so by clicking on the three dots in your chat window and select Save Chat, and it will be sent to your email. So, Chuck, thank you again for speaking to all of us. It was a joy. And for everyone else, we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you and good night.
Good night.
And if my team could just stay around briefly afterwards.
Ted?
Yes.
Yeah, I was able to record on my computer. I might have a good recording. If I do, then you don't have to do anything.
Okay. I think I also have it on mine. So let me know if you need me to do anything.
If I do not contact you, don't worry about it. I've got it.
And Melina, are you still with us? I don't think she does. Possibility to follow up with a couple questions to the guests. She was late. Okay, start at 7:30. Oh, well, no, she's already gone. Anyway.
That was a good, solid model presentation, Chuck, really, on a topic which is sort of in the back of anybody's mind, but there's so many moving parts in there, and you covered so many of them so well. Thank you.
Obscure. So,
do we want there's still some participants in here. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about it. Al and Steve and Jet are all with our military group. Anyway, Joseph, Don, Peter, Kathy, Mike, if you need help exiting, we can work with you on that.
You fell asleep.
Aaron?
I'll leave. I'm curious to see what happens, but I'll go now. Thank you.
Oh, Chuck, that was fascinating. Just very eye-opening. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. You don't have to stick around for this next part. If there's anything, though, that you would like to pass to us about things we could do better, was that format good for you?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I usually just do like military or government audiences, like foreign military audiences. So it was kind of the first time I've been something kind of a for the public kind of thing on this topic. So yeah, I appreciate if you need anything, let me know.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
But you can stay on, Chuck. You're a military guy. You can stay on.
Well, the
If
kids,
you want,
the
we're
kids
not going
just
to
got
talk
home.
military stuff, though.
Yeah, the kids just got home. So
This is all going to be now